Welcome to the BAPS Better Living podcast, the Dharmic Live series, where we're taking questions that people have about spirituality and we're trying to find an interesting answer to them. In our previous episode, we talked a lot about how you can have everything going on for you in your life. You could have made it in your life, but there's still a sense of, there's still a lack of satisfaction in how things are going in your life. And I think in this episode, what I really want to do is talk about what that means, right? What does it actually mean to be spiritual? We're recording this at the start of 2026. A lot of people are taking on these New Year's resolutions. They're trying out yoga classes, yogasana classes. They're trying out silent retreats. They're signing up for these sorts of things. I'm seeing a lot of my friends posting on Facebook, on LinkedIn, all those sorts of things about new practices that they're taking on. Maybe they're taking on meditation. Maybe they're taking on some sort of fitness activity. Maybe they're taking on a more mindfulness type activity. They're decluttering their homes. They're getting rid of all these sorts of things. And they're trying to find a lot more peace in their life. But I think I've had this question for a long time, right? There's so many things you could be doing, and it all feels good. It all sounds really interesting and good. But what does it actually mean to be spiritual? And I've had this question in my mind for a long time, and I'm excited today to get into this question with my co-hosts, Rashmi and Kashyap. It's great to have you guys. As you were thinking about this, and I know we talked about this even at the end of our last episode, what's coming up for you? What does it actually mean to be spiritual? Maybe you're seeing some of these things with your friends about new things that they're trying out in this new year. What's your reaction to that?
I think we have to differentiate feeling spiritual and actually being spiritual. And I think back to other things that we see posted on social media. For example, you see these influencers and these people who I suspect or I know have good intent that go out and do charitable things. They'll take someone who's experiencing homelessness and they'll give them money, they'll give them a makeover, they'll give them a haircut, they'll give them a new outfit. And many people will like those things and they will follow those things. And you'll see the number of followers these influencers have, and it's hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. And that leads to sponsorships and funding, and then they're able to do bigger and bigger things. But does liking somebody that is doing charitable work make you inherently charitable? Is that charity, or is it something that you do to feel like you're being good, feel like you're being charitable? Much in the same way about civil rights. We've seen, issues and challenges of civil rights over the last several years. And many people will participate in social media campaigns in which they show their advocacy in the support of civil rights against oppressed groups. However, does that mean you're actually doing anything real in terms of civil rights? There's something about performance in social media for your peers, for your community. And then there's something about actually doing something. And the worry or the challenge that I experience is how do you differentiate the two? So for me, it's, what is the definition of spirituality? And quite simply, it is striving or searching for something that's greater than yourself, above your own ego, and not just feeling it, but actually doing something about it.
I think that's right. I think there's, what you were saying, Kashyap, earlier about some people are doing something that's a bit performative, or sometimes it's even internal, right? Where, maybe I'm liking a post or I'm posting something about something that I believe in, right? But a lot of the times it's just to help me just kind of feel feel the warm and fuzzies of oh, I'm a good person. I did something good. I'm posting something that people align with, or it's, socially acceptable, or, that's, I'm showing my support. It just reminded me of this comedian. He does this bit where he's talking about, he's a comedian, he's famous, and he gets to fly first class now. That's his life. That's his reality. He flies first class. And he said, he was sitting in his chair, he was sitting in his first class cabin, and he saw a U.S. Army person, coming down the aisle. And in his mind, he was just I would love to give him my seat. He's going off to war. He's doing something that's, really, he's dedicating his life to the country. It would be such a small gesture on my part. I could give him my seat. It would mean so much to him. And, by the time he's finishing that thought, the army guy walks by him And he's like, I didn't ever actually do the thing. I didn't actually give him my seat, but I just felt good about it. I felt the warm and fuzzies. And he's like, I between going from East Coast to West Coast, I rode that high all the way to the West Coast. Just the idea of doing something nice. And that's kind of what reminded me of what you're saying. I think a lot of times people kind of think spirituality is kind of like that. It just makes me feel good. And maybe I don't have to do as much. I just have to feel good about it.
I think it's important not to be judgmental, right? This is not intended to be judgmental. This is about everybody's personal journey. And, those of us that want to be on that path and those listeners today who presumptively are on that path as well. Otherwise, why would you be listening to a podcast like this? Have to be very honest with ourselves because, we should judge other people by their intentions, not necessarily their actions, understanding that people are flawed and people may make mistakes. However, we should judge ourselves really by our actions and not our intentions. So I mean to do good, but am I actually doing good? So the way we judge other people, the way we judge ourselves, there's a fine line and it's an important difference. But, I think of, people that I know that say things like, I'm spiritual, but not religious, right? I'm connected to the universe. I, seeing a sunset or being one with nature aligns me, right? But the real question becomes aligned with what? You're one with what? What is your understanding and belief in that? And I think that statement, I'm spiritual, but not religious, really distills down to being spiritual without actually, feeling spiritual without actually being spiritual, because that statement usually means my values change according to my mood or my circumstances. I do what comforts me and I really push away with actually what challenges me. Those people that believe in austerity as a spiritual path in terms of fasting, for example, and many faiths have the fast as a part of the spiritual practice. It's uncomfortable. Going without food or going without water is uncomfortable. But the fact that you participate and you actively pursue something like that indicates that you're actually being spiritual. You're actually doing something versus this idea that, this month I'm going to go to a meditation retreat. And then the month after that, I'm going to a bachelor's trip in Cabo and having a good time with my friends. And, without any understanding of a code of conduct, any understanding of limiting myself, not based upon what feels good to me, but based upon a greater calling.
So some of the, as you guys both were speaking, there's a couple of like themes that I was kind of picking up on and cataloging in my head. So there's two sides of it. People feel spirituality is, I think, innately internal. There's an internal part of it, which is I'm looking within, I'm trying to find some deeper meaning of myself or of the world, right? And then there's looking outwardly and saying, how do I bring what I think is my value system or my principles, and how do I behave in that way externally, right? There's two kind of parts. And so I think that's fairly true. I think when we think about spirituality, the idea or the image, like if we asked anybody, like, close your eyes, what's this idea of spirituality? What's the image that comes to mind? And it's somebody seated in like an asana posture, hands out, they're meditating, eyes closed. Maybe there's a mountain in the background. That's what we think is spirituality. It's something about nature. It's something about our innate nature. And so I think all of those things are somewhat true. There is something about spirituality that's external. And I think that's the part there where people probably struggle the most of like, how do I bring this internal spirituality out and how do I behave in that way? There's also something about it that's internal. And I think that internal part, there's a word in Sanskrit that we use. It's called adhyatma or adhyatam. And what that really translates to is pertaining to the Atma. And Atma is we translate Atma as the soul. So when we think about that in Hinduism, spirituality really means something that pertains to the Atma, something that pertains to the soul. And I think, you were asking earlier though, well, what's kind of our take on what spirituality is? I think spirituality has a lot to do with how do I identify myself internally? Do I believe myself to be the soul, or do I believe myself to be the body? And then based on my values and principles and how I identify, I bring that to the external world. And it should mean something to me. I should behave in a way that those two things, are not at odds with each other.
I think you're bringing up an interesting point because quite often, Kashyap, you talked about at the start of this episode, there's so much performance out there, people posting on social media, these quotes, etc., dressing up in certain clothing, the yoga clothing that you can buy for $500 or something like that, very, very expensive yoga mats, and look a certain way. And we think that is spirituality because it's hard to know what true spirituality actually is. And so we latch onto, this is not an indictment on people who are doing these sorts of things because it's hard to know what true spirituality might actually be. Sometimes it's a performance because that's all you know to do. That's all you know that you truly do end up thinking that this is being spiritual. And then Rashmi, you're bringing up a different point. You're saying that, well, it's all an internal process and it's hard to see it externally. You can't really take a photo of it. And all these influencers out there, all these people out there talking about spirituality, there isn't a photo they can take of their internal state. And so what they have to do is they have to resort to posting quotes and mantras and all these other sorts of things that signals that, I am a spiritual person. And I think that's where maybe a lot of this misunderstanding arises from, where there's something deeply internal happening, but there's no way to show that. And it's hard to articulate it. And so you end up latching on to these more external shows of spirituality. So you go on these retreats, you take a photo by the mountains in a meditative pose, but this is something completely different. This is about a relationship, really. And we've talked about this in previous episodes as well. It's about a relationship with this deeper inner self and being even beyond that. So it's interesting to just sort of see these two things come out in contrast.
I think both of you made some great points. It's, the understanding of our true selves. That's step one. But then step two is actually acting accordingly, is actually doing. When I think of my own personal spirituality, quite simply for me, a couple of basic, questions or litmus tests. If my spirituality, my definition of spirituality doesn't really ask me to sacrifice anything, if it doesn't make me uncomfortable, if it doesn't challenge or contradict my basic instincts, and if it doesn't require consistency, then I'm probably not getting as much out of it as I really should. Then it becomes more about making me feel better about myself and actually becoming a better version of myself. Because that type of spirituality that doesn't require any of those things, it's more about affirmation as opposed to transcendence or formation.
Let me push back on that front, because what you're saying is that, well, we got to deny our basic instinct. We have to deny our true nature. But I think this is where I know I've personally gotten stuck on this point, that why would I need to deny my true self? Why would I need to stop being authentic to be someone else? I have a mind. I have the ability to think for myself. Why can't I actually go down this path? Like, why can't I pick and choose for myself what's right for me? Because it is difficult, right? There's so many choices out there. Let me pick what's right for me. What's wrong with that?
I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. And I think many of us may actually know people that have this rugged individualism, this desire to go it on their own. And that's okay. But actively ignoring thousands of years of human history, philosophy, scripture, text, isn't very conducive to actually getting the job done. We may know a handful of people that have gone on their own and sought these paths, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I wanted to be an architect and I had a public library card and I was just going in and checking out books and reading about architecture, I potentially could become a great architect. However, there's also a high likelihood that the bridge that I build is upside down or collapses. Rather, going to school for 4 years or getting a master's longer than 4 years in architecture, learning from people that have done this, dedicated their lives to it, probably will allow me to be a better architect. So is it possible? Yes, to do it on your own. Is it likely? No, it's not. It just isn't. That's just the reality of it. And I am fine saying that trying to go on my own on this path of spirituality and believing, genuinely believing it is going to be efficient, or I will be capable of coming up on my own with thousands of years of learnings, is unlikely.
I think quite often there's a romanticization. Like it's almost romantic to think about, I am on this path by myself. The Robert Frost poem that Take the Path Less Taken, it already feels that the number of people taking a spiritual path are few and far between. So it makes you think that the path of spirituality is fundamentally an isolated path. It's a path that you take on yourself. But from what you're saying, actually, the path of spirituality has been tried and tested over centuries, over millennia, by many, many people, and they have perfected a path. And there's no harm in actually picking a path that works for so many other people, right? You don't need to take on this sense of rugged individualism. You don't need to have a romantic path where you kind of are out by yourself, you're suffering, you're asking all these big questions, because there's a library out there of people who have some of these answers figured out for you. So embrace it. Take on this path. It's totally okay to go out in there and do that. I'm curious from your perspective, Rashmi, what's coming up? Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of this Sanskrit aphorism that I've heard many times. It's Mahajana. Mahajana means great people. And Gata Sapanta, the path that they have laid out for us, if you follow the path of great people who have preceded us, you're likely to get to a similar destination that they have gotten to. And so it just reminds me of what, it kind of connects what you were saying, Dhaval and Kashyap, like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We should take it and run with it and do something even greater, right? Example would be, there's people who have created these computer languages, these coding languages. If I sought out to go and just create my own language, there's a likelihood that I falter and fail there. But if I take a language that someone's already built, someone's already designed, and it works, I can take that and build something even greater or different, or it helps me get to a similar end, right? And so I think that's what this quote kind of tells me, like, Mahajana yenagata gata sapanta. There's a path in spirituality in particular that great spiritual masters have preceded us. And we can follow in their path and get to similar ends and attain that spiritual enlightenment.
The writer, William James, he said something that I find very interesting. It's spirituality isn't about ideas. It's not just about ideas. It's about lived experiences that reorder our priorities and behavior. And I think that's significant. It's lived experiences. It's about doing something in a consistent, organized way. It's repetition. In the real world, following a path that is thoughtful, that is organized, that is intentional, that holds you to a certain standard, makes a difference for 99.999% of the society.
But let's be honest, it's meant to be a bit difficult, right? I think the proposition of you giving up your choices, of you having to stick to this extremely strict code is intimidating. It's terrifying. It's much easier to just sort of pick and choose, set the bar for yourself at a manageable or achievable level. And I think people just get intimidated by it. I don't know what you guys think about that, because I think it's a fair fear that people have that if I commit to this path, it's going to be too difficult. I'm going to give up. I'm going to fail. And therefore I will be a failure. And therefore I will no longer be spiritual. What's your reaction to that?
it brings up a couple of things for me. I think up until now, we've been talking about spirituality. We keep using the word spirituality. And I think there's another phrase that we should think about or talk about. It's called spiritual practice, right? It's the actual practice of spirituality. It's a journey. And along the way, I'm growing in this journey. As a spiritual aspirant, I'm maybe in the elementary stages of my spiritual practice, in my spirituality. And so what genuine and best effort and, consistency looks like at this elementary level may not be what it means when I'm at a more progressed level in my spirituality. I've spent some time at this monastery where swamis go to study, young swamis, they go to study in this, village in India. And it is this kind of like idea of what we think spirituality is. It's a bunch of young people, they're studying to be swamis and monks, and they're doing spiritual practice. But what's really great about this monastery is they're spiritual leaders and guides, not leaders, but they're spiritual guides there who really help show you the right way. And I spent some time there, and I was spending some time with one of the teachers there at this monastery. And I saw, I went to his room in the evening, and he was just kind of winding down for the evening, and he picked up a book, a Hindu scripture, and he was reading it. And it was a book that he had taught a class on earlier that day. And it was a book that he's teaching year after year on this same book, this same spiritual, scripture, this Hindu scripture to these, swamis in study. And so I asked him after he was done reading it, I was like, do you read this now every day because it's just part of your practice? It's just part of like your daily routine and it's just something you do? Or do you find value in reading this scripture every day? Because it's hard for me to imagine if I'm teaching off of a syllabus year after year after year, I know it all now. Like, how can I continue to gain something out of it? And that's kind of where my head was at. So I was curious what he was going to say. And his response is something that I still think about all the time. And I think it's only the response that someone who has been practicing spirituality for such a long time can say. And he said it very, openly to me. He said, I continue to find as I read and flip through these pages and read this scripture, it means something different to me every day. And the reason for that is I'm at a different point in my journey every day. So the same thing that I read 10 years ago, this scripture that tells me about spiritual practice, what I read 10 years ago translates and means something very different to me 10 years later, because I'm on a totally different path of my journey now. I'm at a different level of spiritual maturity. And so he's like, where you are in your spiritual path, this scripture means something different because you're only able to grasp as much as you can where you are in the moment. When 10 years later, it's going to mean something totally different to you. And so I think that's kind of the idea behind spiritual practice is like, or sometimes we struggle with it is, well, why am I not able to do this? Or why do I feel like I'm not I'm not able to do the spiritual practice perfectly? But maybe you are doing it. You're doing it perfectly for where you are in your journey at that time.
I think what you're saying is that it's a feature, not a bug. Like it's meant to be a bit difficult. You are going to struggle. And if you are struggling, that means you're at the edge of your comfort zone. And that's a good thing. You are at the cusp of being able to progress even further. And it's not glamorous. It's not exciting. It's not something that's shareable on social media. You can't take a good photo of it, but it's the inner work that really ends up mattering a lot more. Confronting these difficult choices and choosing the spiritual nature over everything else. Like that is a difficult thing to do, but it's valuable. And you don't have to chastise yourself that you're not perfect because it's an ever evolving path. You will face struggles, you will face challenges, and that's totally okay.
And it's by design to some extent. And so there's a guru, Gunatitanand Swami. In his talks, he gives this example, and it's a very practical example. He says, imagine if a king has a son, And he wants that son to grow old and grow older and be ready to take on the kingdom. He wants him to become an adult. But if he has a little child, if I just keep feeding that child for 24 hours, if I just keep feeding that child food and milk, and he doesn't turn into an 18-year-old overnight. And he goes, the spiritual path is like that. It's by design, it's going to take its time. It's not if I just do a bunch of spiritual things in 24 hours, now I've just, jumped to the next level. It's not how it works. A child has to be nourished, and it grows as it grows, and it's by design. It grows over time. That's the example that he gives. And that's what spirituality is as well. It's not something like, oh, if I go and just pump myself full of spirituality, I'm going to jump to the next spiritual level overnight.
I think that's a great point, Dashmi. Sometimes we have these aha moments, and it fills us with unbelievable joy and inspiration, and they feel transformative. I remember, 2 years ago, watching the sunrise over the Grand Canyon, and it was winter, so it was ice and snow everywhere, and it was truly an extraordinary moment. But that feeling lasts in the moment. It feels spiritual, but is it really? Because what you're saying, Nashmi, is that being spiritual, it makes life meaningful, not just in the moment, but over decades, and it takes time. You don't go out the first day when you're training for a marathon and run 26 miles. There's a process. It's one step in front of the other, inch by inch. And then eventually in 6 months or a year, you're able to cross the finish line. But if you tried to do that on day one, you're going to fail.
That's right. Yeah. It reminds me, there's this, the idea of what we were just saying, practice. Like, for a marathon, you have to practice, you have to prepare. And what we were talking about earlier is the word spiritual practice. And maybe like a translation, there's a word that's kind of in the zeitgeist. The idea is sadhana. Sadhana is, doing spiritual endeavors, practicing spirituality. And someone who does sadhana is a sadhak, right? Someone who practices spirituality is a sadhak. And there's something to be said about someone who is a spiritual aspirant, a sadhak. And they put in practice what you were saying, Kashyap, right? Is every day, a little bit of practice, consistent practice, genuine effort, intention, purpose. And it can look very different for each person every day. And it doesn't have to be a whole lot all at once.
So, Rashmi, I think that's a very valid point. It makes a lot of sense. Quite simply, we've been talking for a while, but it seems to me that perhaps an effective way to define spirituality is that understanding that life carries a moral weight, right? The choices we make have a moral weight to them. And understanding that and acting accordingly, even when we don't feel like it, even when acting like there isn't a morality that exists, would be more convenient for us. And then hand in hand with that is having some grace and kindness to ourselves, realizing that we are not perfect and that it will be a process, a very long process, that we may make mistakes, we may stumble, but that's okay because that's part of the journey.
Okay. It reminded me of this story I had read. It's part of a book called Eating Animals, written by Jonathan Safran Foer. And he shares early on in the book a story that he had heard from his grandmother. And his grandmother was alive during World War II. I think she was escaping from one of the concentration camps, and she was making her way by foot towards Russia, where she was hoping to find, safe haven away from the Nazis and, away from Germany. And as she was making her way to Russia, she wasn't, there wasn't she didn't have a bunch of resources with her. She didn't have any food or anything like that. And I'm, afraid for her life. So she was probably not likely to try to go and talk to someone or try to beg for food or anything like that. And so throughout that process, she's just depleting her physical resources. She's, becoming skin and bone. And she finally makes it to Russia, and she makes her way to this house that she sees, and it's a farm. And she knocks on the door, and she's looking for some safe haven. And the Russian farmer sees her, and he sees that she's just totally skin and bones, and he offers to her this piece of pork, which for someone in the Jewish faith, that's not kosher. And so she doesn't accept it. She doesn't eat that, piece of pork, which is, and so Jonathan in the story is just like, he's in disbelief. How can you be, you haven't eaten in days. You are starving very clearly. Why would you not eat whatever's given to you at that time? And she says something that was really profound. She says, if nothing matters, then there's nothing to save. And I think that really highlights what you were saying, Kashyap, that spirituality and this kind of moral weight, it's important. It should mean something to us. And if nothing matters, then my choices don't matter. What I do, what I choose to do, how I act, none of that matters if nothing matters. If my spirituality doesn't matter, then nothing matters. And there's nothing to save then, right? And so I think that's what, that just reminded me of that story. Like, our choices matter. And if we're a spiritual aspirant, if we're a sadhak, behaving in a way that aligns with our morals and our values and our spiritual beliefs, it's important. It should matter. It should be worth worth saving.
And that quite simply is being spiritual. I think that's a beautiful definition.
That's a profound story. And I think it gives a dimension, what it actually means to be spiritual, in a way that's quiet, in a way that's not showy. And it tells us the importance of showing up, being consistent, and where that practice can actually lead you. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be challenging. You're going to be at the edge of your comfort zone. You're going to be at the edge of transcending your ego in search of this elusive thing, which is your true self, your inner self, that's beyond the body mind, and something even greater than that, a being that's even greater than that. But it's meant to be a path that you don't have to walk on by yourself. It's a path that many others have explored, who have gone on, and you can take on those ideas. You can take on a path prescribed by others and go at it on that path. So it's a deeply internal thing. It's not something you can show off. But if you walk down that path, then the reward will certainly be satisfying. It's going to be something that fulfills you much more than just sort of, sharing these quotes. And the reason why I think we like to share these quotes, the reason why we like to show these things is because we know ultimately the true practice of spirituality will give us a beautiful reward. If even those quotes, if even those photos inspire us, then think about what it means to actually walk down this path that may seem difficult at the beginning, but over time, you have this deep inner sense of satisfaction, this deep inner sense of fulfillment. And that's what the Dharmic life is all about. So thank you so much for listening to this episode. We're going to continue these conversations in future episodes. Please please subscribe to this episode and this podcast, and leave a review because it helps us reach this message to a lot more people. Thank you so much, and namaste.